Let's talk about polygamy. Alright, first things first. What on earth does the word polygamy mean? Well, it comes from the Greek word polygamos, meaning often marrying or married. Now, the word polygamy is really an umbrella term that refers to any marriage arrangement involving more than two spouses. Now, the two forms of polygamy that are relevant to our discussion are polygyny and polyandry. Now, while the first involves one male and multiple females, the second involves one female and multiple males. Let's dig up its origins. Where the Shabbalat. But before doing so, I do want to point out a few things as a caveat. I want to make it crystal clear that I'm exclusively addressing an audience that believes that marriage, as we traditionally understand it to be, is a sacred institution through which a family's lineage should be expanded. Because trust me, if you don't believe that marriage is sacrosanct, then nothing we're going to say today is going to make any sense to you. Also, I do not intend to discuss polygamy from a religious point of view. Now, obviously, I'm a Muslim who recognizes his biases towards the Islamic position, but I will, to the best of my ability, try to discuss the subject matter, suppressing those prejudices. And so, if you do not believe in the sanctity of marriage, or you believe this is going to be a religious discussion, I'm sorry, but this ain't the video for that. I'm sure there are ample content available out there that address the subject matter from those aspects. Now, what I do intend to do in this video is highlight the origins of polygamy, to unpack whether or not there is any merit to this highly controversial practice, before finally putting forward my personal views and recommendations. C'est bon? C'est bon. And with these precursors in mind, let's engage in the discussion. Now, the practice of polygamy was said to have existed since ancient times. In ancient Mesopotamia, for example, polygyny was practiced by men in all ranks of society. Sociologist George Murdoch in 1967 showed that polygamy has been acceptable in 80% of cultures. Now, according to a 1998 study done by the University of Wisconsin that examined 1,000 communities, it was found that 60% of such communities had polygyny, right, one man, multiple women, practiced within them, whereas only 4 of the communities that were examined had polyandry, one female, multiple males practiced within them. Now, the remaining 40% had polygyny practiced within them, but it wasn't a common thing. Now, in terms of where the practice was prevalent, writer on socioeconomic affairs Paul Valley found that animist and Muslim-dominated communities like those in West Africa were the hotspots. Now, anthropologists Altman and Ginat's 1996 report similarly concluded that Northern Africa and Middle Eastern societies of the past and present had polygyny widespread within them. Now, it is very important to note, as pointed out by Altman and Ginat's study, that even though a lot of these cultures and communities have accepted polygyny, it is only 10% of men that actually engage in it. Now, fast forward to our current times, we see that the number of people engaging in this practice seem to decrease. While most scholars agree that urbanization has been the primary cause, they differ in terms of what they mean by the term urbanization. So you got some that are associated with social status and education, but others that refer to it in an economic sense, meaning it is way more costly for a man to maintain more than one family in cities relative to maintaining more than one family in rural areas of the country. Now, with this general background in mind, we may now pose the all-important question, and that is, what the acheke inspires a person to want to marry more than one spouse? One partner not enough for you. Say be Superman, Superwoman. Now, most of us have probably heard the same justifications. It's a cultural thing, right? In relation to men, they say men are naturally polygamous. Now, I personally wouldn't give too much credence to that argument because, well, even if it was true, right? Just because you have an inclination or the tendency to do something doesn't mean you gotta act upon it, right? That's like saying, well, since my forefathers were alcoholics, then that would mean that I'm predisposed to drinking, and so I'm gonna continue the legacy. Now, I don't know the scientific data on whether or not your drinking problem is something you've genetically inherited. It may very well be. But in this discussion, we will not rely on the nature of men and women, simply because what sets us human beings apart from other animals in the animal kingdom is our self-consciousness, our ability to rationalize and engage in practices that are coherent and sustainable for our societies. As such, this discussion will for the most part focus on the societal impacts of polygamy. C'est bon? C'est bon. Allons-y. Now, we've already established that even in communities where this practice has been acceptable, it is only a small fraction of people that engage in it. So the ultimate question is, or more importantly, does this practice that is widely acceptable but hardly applied bring about more benefit to a society than it does harm. Let's look at the arguments for and against it. Now, on the supporting end, the claim that is usually made is in relation to the male and female ratio in a particular demographic. Now, according to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs, UNDESA, the ratio of male and females born into this world is more or less equal. Now, despite this fact, however, the same source goes on to say that there are higher male infant deaths and higher male adult deaths because men take up riskier jobs, such as mining, construction, and truck driving, to name a few. Now, taking the argument a step further, when we talk about marriage, we know that women practice hypergamy, meaning they tend to marry men that are of a higher socioeconomic status to them. This entails that a lot of the financial responsibilities are imposed on the man. Accordingly, a man that is financially unstable and or in prison is generally excluded from a woman's pool of men to consider marrying. So now you begin to see why there are far less men considered ready for marriage compared to women. Now, it's interesting to note that in countries like Nepal and Tibet, back when people heavily relied on farming to make a living for themselves and their families, it was actually the case that a monogamous couple would get another man on board to assist with the finances. Hence, they would have marriage unions made up of one woman and multiple men who'd seldom be at home at the same time due to the nature and timing of their jobs. Make sense? Yeah. Well, then why has polyandry been outdated in Nepal, Tibet, India, and in other communities today? Why isn't it as acceptable as polygyny? A curious mind might rightfully pose. Well, studies done by Gurung and Pokharel in 2012 state that the reason the practice had died out in Nepal among other countries was due to a shift in the socio-economic and political landscape, such as the fact that there was less reliance on transhumance trade and farming. They're basically saying that polyandry fulfilled a particular purpose for a particular community during a particular time, and as time went on, there was no longer a need for it. Now, you're probably still wondering, why not bring back polyandry? Well, for starters, I could refer to the fact that was mentioned earlier, that there are fewer men in society compared to women. So think of it this way. If more women began taking up multiple husbands, then there would be even fewer male suitors for unmarried women in society. But you know what? Let's assume that women no longer practice hypergamy. Wouldn't it give men that would otherwise not qualify for marriage an opportunity to get married, eh? Or, from another angle, wouldn't that increase the pool of men that women could choose from? Well, if we're being brutally honest, the answer is yes, it would. However, studies have shown us that there is an increase in the possibility for females to develop lifetime health issues when they copulate with multiple men, but the same issue is far less the case when males copulate with multiple women. So even though it is the case that polygamy, in principle, confines the spreading of STDs if all the partners remain loyal to one another at the marriage, the fact still stands that partners in a polyandrous arrangement are far more likely to contract STDs. Now, in addition to that, we know that you can have a situation where there are multiple pregnancies in a polygynous arrangement, but the same is not the case in a polyandrous one. In other words, it's possible for one man to have several of his wives pregnant concurrently, but one woman can only be impregnated by one of her several husbands at a time. Did I say that right? Now, I know marriage is not all about sex and reproduction, but if you remember, we did describe it as a sacred institution, primarily through which a family's lineage should be expanded. So let's look at it like this. If more potent men get involved in polyandrous arrangements with potent women who undergo menstrual cycles and can only be pregnant once at a time, then Africa is bound to realize a population decline. Now, unless you buy into the notion that Africa is relatively small and overpopulated despite it being able to fit the US, China, India, and still have space for a lot of European countries, and unless you support the idea that Africa should embrace a population decline as opposed to find ways to effectively manage our abundance of natural resources and human capital, then polyandry that hinders reproduction might not be a great idea. Let's do a recap of what we've done so far. So firstly, we discussed that there are mainly two forms of polygamy. Polygyny, one man, multiple women. Polyandry, one woman, multiple men. Thereafter, we highlighted that polygyny, as opposed to polyandry, was prevalent in societies throughout human history. And then we explored some of the rationale behind why communities practice polygyny. The fact that there are more females than males in the world, whether due to natural causes like higher male infant deaths, or due to men taking up more dangerous jobs, or due to women being, hypergamous, or lastly, for reproduction purposes. Now, in part 2 of this episode, yes, I said part 2, seeing that we still have a lot more to discuss, we'll highlight some of the main issues that come with the practice of polygamy and see whether or not we can work our way around them. So yeah, Stay tuned, and please remember, Adibeng.